Terry Kirk sat in this plush leather seat of the first-class carriage on the London-Edinburgh Express, his tailored maroon suit damp with sweat, his 6-month-old daughter Lila's screams cutting through the rhythmic clatter of train wheels like a knife through silk. For over an hour, every passenger in the carriage had been subjected to the relentless crying that no amount of money, privilege, or desperation seemed able to stop. Terry had tried everything. He'd walked the narrow aisle bouncing Lila, offered her bottles she refused, changed her diaper twice in the cramped train toilet, and even pulled up calming baby videos on his phone pressed close to her tiny face. Nothing worked. The other first-class passengers were shooting him increasingly hostile looks. The train attendants had offered sympathetic suggestions that failed miserably. Even the elderly woman across the aisle clutched her pearls and sighed audibly every few minutes, as if his daughter's distress were a personal offense. Terry felt the walls of the luxury carriage closing in, his composure crumbling with each piercing cry. That's when something unthinkable happened. A teenage black girl from the economy section walked up the aisle toward Terry's seat, her worn pink t-shirt clean but fraying at the edges, her backpack patched with fabric squares. Without introducing herself or asking permission, the girl gently reached toward the screaming baby. "Sir, may I try?" she asked quietly, her young voice somehow cutting through Lila's wails. Terry was so exhausted and desperate that he didn't even question why a stranger, let alone a teenager from economy class, was offering to help. He simply nodded, too tired to care about protocol or propriety. The moment the girl's hands touched Lila, something miraculous happened. The screaming stopped. Complete, absolute silence fell over the entire train carriage as passengers held their breath, waiting to see if this impossible quiet would last. The teenager was holding Lila with a confidence that seemed impossible for someone her age, gently swaying in rhythm with the train's motion while humming a soft melody that Terry had never heard before. Lila's eyes, which had been squeezed shut in distress for over an hour, slowly opened and focused on the girl's face. For the first time since they'd left King's Cross Station, she looked calm, peaceful, almost happy. "How did you?" Terry whispered, staring at this mysterious teenager who had accomplished what trained nannies and expensive baby consultants couldn't achieve. The girl smiled gently. "My baby brother used to cry like this. I learned what works. It's all about rhythm and warmth." Terry looked around the cabin and saw something that made his heart race with disbelief. Every single passenger was staring at them, not with annoyance anymore, but with amazement and gratitude. But what shocked Terry most was what he noticed about this young woman who had just performed a miracle with his daughter. The girl's worn backpack was covered with literary competition badges and poetry slam pins. Her notebook, visible through a torn side pocket, was filled with handwritten verses and crossed-out lines. And there was an intelligence in her eyes, a depth and maturity that seemed far beyond her years. "Who are you? Terry asked, his voice filled with wonder and curiosity. The teenager looked Terry directly in the eyes with a maturity that was startling. "My name is Tammy Green. I'm 16 years old. I'm from Southwark in South London, and I'm on my way to Edinburgh to compete in the National Youth Poetry Championship." Terry felt his world shift as he realized that the person who had just saved his sanity and his daughter's comfort wasn't some trained professional or wealthy peer. She was a brilliant teenager from one of London's most challenging neighborhoods. But as Tammy continued to hold Lila, who was now gurgling contentedly and reaching for Tammy's braids, Terry had no idea that this chance encounter was about to reveal a story of resilience, compassion, and hidden genius that would change both their lives forever. And neither of them knew that what happened next would challenge everything Terry thought he knew about worth, empathy, and what it truly means to help someone in need. Tammy Green had been sitting in the economy carriage when she first heard the baby crying. At first, it was just background noise, something distant and muffled, carried down the train corridor alongside the rumble of wheels on rails. But as the minutes stretched on, the sound grew sharper, more persistent, more desperate. Tammy shifted in her seat near the window, trying to focus on the poetry anthology open in her lap. She was supposed to be rehearsing for the National Youth Poetry Competition in Edinburgh, the biggest opportunity of her 16 years. But the baby's cries kept pulling her attention away from the printed words. Around her, the economy carriage was packed tight with passengers. A middle-aged man across the aisle muttered complaints into his phone. Two university students a few rows ahead exchanged annoyed glances. An elderly woman tugged her headphones tighter over her ears. Nobody seemed concerned, just irritated. But Tammy couldn't shake the feeling. That particular pitch in the baby's cry, high, frantic, inconsolable, triggered something deep in her memory. She closed her eyes and was suddenly back in the cramped, two-bedroom council flat in Southwark, holding her baby brother Jamie as he wailed through the night. Her mother had been working a double shift at the community shelter. Tammy, just 14 at the time, had walked him back and forth across the worn carpet, desperate to soothe him while her younger siblings slept. Jamie had cried exactly like that before the pneumonia took him 6 months later. The memory still carved through her chest like a blade. Tammy opened her eyes and stared down at her patched backpack resting between her feet, the same one covered with poetry, slam badges, and competition pins. Inside was her competition piece, printed neatly on recycled paper. Her ticket to Edinburgh had been crowdfunded by neighbors and teachers who believed in her. This trip was supposed to change her life. She couldn't afford distractions. She couldn't afford to care about someone else's crying baby in first class. But the sound kept coming. Relentless, raw, painful. Tammy bit her lip and tried to return to her poem, but the words on the page blurred together. In her mind, she saw Jamie's tiny face red and wet with tears. She remembered the helplessness of not knowing what to do, the shame of calling NHS Direct at 2 in the morning, the crushing weight of responsibility that no 14-year-old should carry. But she also remembered the moment she finally figured it out, the specific rhythm of rocking, the low hum that matched her mother's old shelter lullaby, the gentle pressure on his back that seemed to ease whatever pain he couldn't name. If someone had known how to help Jamie sooner, would he still be here? The thought hit her like a punch to the stomach. Tammy closed the book and tucked it into her backpack. Her hands were trembling slightly as she stood. Several passengers glanced up at her, their expressions neutral and dismissive. She was just another black teenager in worn clothes moving through the train, invisible. But as Tammy made her way toward the connector doors between carriages, her heart began to pound. She knew what crossing into first class meant. She'd walked past it when boarding, the plush leather seats, the wider aisles, the passengers in tailored suits sipping complimentary drinks. People like her didn't belong there. People like her got stared at, questioned, sometimes asked to show their tickets just to prove they had the right to exist in the same space. Fear whispered in her ear, "Turn back, mind your business. You'll embarrass yourself." But the crying continued, echoing down the corridor like a plea. Tammy pushed through the connector door. The shift was immediate. The economy carriage had been cramped and loud. First class was spacious and eerily quiet except for the baby's screams. Passengers sat in leather seats with ample legroom. Newspapers folded on mahogany tables. Glasses of wine half empty. Every single one of them looked up as Tammy entered, their eyes tracking her worn pink t-shirt, her fraying backpack, her cheap trainers. She felt the weight of their judgment settle over her like a heavy coat. A businessman in a gray suit frowned. The elderly woman with pearls clutched her purse a little tighter. Tammy's cheeks burned, but she kept walking, her eyes fixed on the source of the crying. And then she saw him, a man in a maroon suit, slumped in his seat like someone who'd been defeated by life itself. His expensive watch caught the light as he bounced a tiny baby against his chest, sweat staining his collar, exhaustion written across every line of his face. The baby, a little girl with dark curls, screamed and screamed, her small fists balled up in distress. Tammy stopped a few feet away. Her voice felt small in her throat. She could still turn around, pretend she'd been looking for the toilet, escape before anyone asked why she was there. But then the baby let out another wail, sharp, desperate, familiar, and Tammy's feet moved on their own. "Sir, may I try?" she asked quietly, her young voice somehow cutting through the screams. The man looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes. For a moment, Tammy saw the flicker of surprise, maybe suspicion. But mostly she saw exhaustion, defeat, the kind of desperation that made people stop caring about rules and propriety. He nodded, just once. Too tired to speak. Tammy's hands moved with a confidence she didn't feel. She gently took the baby from his arms, and the tiny girl's weight settled against her chest like something sacred. Around them, the entire carriage seemed to hold its breath. The businessman lowered his newspaper. The elderly woman leaned forward. Even the train attendant paused mid-step, watching. Tammy began to sway, not frantically, but slowly, matching the rhythm of the train's motion beneath them. She adjusted the baby's position slightly, applying gentle pressure to her back the way she'd learned with Jamie. And then she began to hum. It was the same lullaby her mother used to sing at the shelter, a soft, repetitive melody passed down from her grandmother, meant to calm frightened children who'd seen too much too soon. Tammy didn't know all the words anymore, but the tune lived in her bones. Edinburgh's, "Hush now, little one, the storm won't last. Hush now, little one, the pain will pass." Within seconds, the impossible happened. The crying stopped. Complete, absolute silence fell over the entire first-class carriage as passengers held their breath, waiting to see if this miraculous quiet would last. The baby's eyes, which had been squeezed shut in distress for over an hour, slowly opened and focused on Tammy's face. Her tiny fists unclenched. Her breathing steadied. And then, impossibly, she let out a soft coo and reached one small hand toward Tammy's braids. Tammy looked down at the baby girl, now peaceful in her arms, and felt tears prick the corners of her eyes. For a moment, she wasn't standing in a first-class train carriage surrounded by strangers. She was back in her flat in Southwark, holding Jamie one last time before the ambulance came. I couldn't save you, she thought, but maybe I can help her. When Tammy finally looked up, she met the eyes of the man in the maroon suit. He was staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Wonder, disbelief, gratitude, maybe something deeper. Around them, every passenger sat frozen, witnesses to something that defied logic and wealth and every assumption they'd carried onto this train. A billionaire's baby, quiet and content in a poor girl's arms. The beginning of everything. The silence in the first-class carriage was louder than any scream. Kirk sat frozen in his seat, staring at the impossible scene before him. His daughter Lila, who had been inconsolable for over an hour, now resting peacefully in the arms of a teenage stranger. The baby's tiny fingers wrapped around one of the girl's braids, her breathing soft and even, her eyes half closed in contentment. Around them, passengers who had been radiating hostility moments before now watched with expressions that bordered on reverence. The elderly woman across the aisle, the one who had clutched her pearls and zzzed with performative annoyance, now smiled softly, her hand pressed to her chest. A businessman in a gray suit lowered his Financial Times completely and muttered, "Remarkable," his voice barely above a whisper. Even the train attendant stood motionless in the aisle, her tray of complimentary drinks forgotten. Terry's mind struggled to process what had just happened. He was a man who built his fortune on logic, data, and predictable outcomes. He'd hired expensive pediatric consultants after Clara died, people with credentials from Cambridge and Oxford, who'd given him scientific explanations for infant distress and evidence-based soothing techniques. None of it had worked. And yet this girl, this poor teenager from economy class with holes in her shirt and worn trainers, had silenced his daughter in seconds. "How did you do that?" Terry whispered, his voice hoarse from exhaustion and disbelief. Tammy looked up from the baby, and for the first time Terry truly saw her face. Not just the poverty in her clothes or the youth in her features, but the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from her eyes. There was a serenity there, a depth of experience that shouldn't belong to someone so young. It unsettled him in a way he couldn't name. "My baby brother used to cry like this," Tammy said softly, her voice carrying the weight of memory. "Jamie. He had terrible colic when he was small. My mom worked nights at a community shelter, so I learned to take care of him and my younger siblings." She shifted Lila slightly, adjusting her position with practiced ease. "It's all about rhythm and warmth. Babies can feel when you're tense, when you're panicking. They need to feel safe." Terry felt something crack open in his chest. "Used to?" he asked carefully. Tammy's expression flickered. Just for a moment, a shadow of grief passing across her face before the serenity returned. "He died 6 months ago. Pneumonia. We We couldn't afford the treatment fast enough. The words hit Terry like a physical blow. 6 months. The same amount of time since Clara had been taken from him. The same helpless rage at a world where money and medicine couldn't save the people you loved. Except Tammy's loss had been different. Not a failure of medical innovation, but a failure of access. A preventable death made inevitable by poverty. "I'm sorry," Terry said, and the words felt pathetically inadequate. "I lost my wife 6 months ago. Cancer. Even with the best doctors, the experimental treatments." He trailed off, staring down at his expensive watch, his tailored suit, the empty first-class seat beside him that Clara would never occupy again. "Money can't buy everything." "No," Tammy agreed quietly, "but it can buy some things." There was no accusation in her voice, just a simple statement of fact. But Terry felt the truth of it settle over him like a weight. His grief was real, devastating, life-altering. But he still had his firm, his fortune, his resources. He could hire nannies when he failed as a father. He could afford first-class tickets and private consultations. His daughter would never die from a treatable illness because he couldn't access a hospital. Tammy's grief was different, raw, unprotected by wealth or privilege. She'd lost her brother and then stepped onto this train alone, carrying her patched backpack toward a future she was building with nothing but talent and determination. And yet here she sat, soothing his daughter with a gentleness that seemed infinite, asking nothing in return. "What's her name?" Tammy asked, breaking the heavy silence. Lila had begun to make soft cooing sounds, her small hands still wrapped around Tammy's braid. "Lila," Terry answered. "Lila Rose Kirk." "That's beautiful," Tammy said, and then she began to hum again, the same melody that had calmed Lila moments before. The tune was unfamiliar to Terry, something old and worn smooth by repetition, like a stone polished by generations of hands. Terry studied Tammy as she rocked his daughter with the practiced rhythm of someone who'd spent years caring for others. The holes in her pink t-shirt weren't just wear from age. They looked like repairs that had been attempted and failed. Her backpack, sitting on the floor beside her seat, was covered with poetry slam badges and literary competition pins. One patch read, "Southwark Youth Voices." Another said, "London Under-18 Slam Champion." "You're a poet," Terry said, his voice filled with curiosity rather than surprise. Tammy nodded, a small smile touching her lips. "I'm heading to Edinburgh for the National Youth Poetry Competition. It's the biggest one in the UK. If I win, there's a scholarship attached, full tuition to university." "And if you don't win?" Terry asked before he could stop himself. Tammy's smile didn't waver, but something hardened in her eyes. "Then I work, save, apply for loans, figure it out, same as always." The answer was delivered without self-pity, just the pragmatic certainty of someone who'd never had the luxury of backup plans or safety nets. Terry recognized something in her tone, the same determination he'd seen in young entrepreneurs pitching their startups to his investment firm. But where those founders had MBAs and seed funding from wealthy parents, Tammy had poetry and a patched backpack and a lullaby learned in a shelter. "What do you write about?" Terry asked, leaning forward slightly. "Survival, hope, inequality." Tammy's voice was steady, confident. "The things people don't want to talk about at dinner parties. The things that matter." Terry felt another crack in the carefully constructed walls he'd built around his grief. For 6 months, he'd surrounded himself with people who spoke in corporate jargon and market projections, people who offered condolences in the same tone they'd used to discuss quarterly earnings, people who expected him to process loss efficiently, like a business problem to be solved and moved past. But Tammy spoke with a rawness that reminded him what it felt like to actually feel something, to sit with pain instead of trying to optimize it away. "My wife used to say that," Terry murmured, almost to himself, "that the things worth doing are the things that make people uncomfortable." Tammy looked at him with an expression that seemed far too wise for 16. "She sounds like she was brilliant." "She was." Terry's voice caught, and he had to clear his throat. "She would have liked you." Outside the window, the English countryside rolled past in shades of green and gold, fields and villages blurring into watercolor streaks. The train rocked gently on its tracks, carrying them north toward Edinburgh, toward futures neither of them could yet imagine. In Tammy's arms, Lila had fallen completely asleep, her small body relaxed and trusting in a way she hadn't been since they'd left London. The businessman across the aisle folded his newspaper and stood, pausing as he passed their seats. "Young lady," he said to Tammy, his voice gruff but sincere, "that was extraordinary. Truly." Tammy ducked her head, embarrassed by the attention. "I just did what anyone would do." "No," the man replied firmly. "You did what most people wouldn't have the courage to do." He nodded respectfully before continuing down the aisle. The elderly woman across from them leaned forward, her earlier disapproval completely erased. "Dear, you have a gift. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Tammy's cheeks flushed, but she smiled gratefully. "Thank you." Terry watched the interaction with growing wonder. These were the same passengers who had shot him hostile looks when Lila was crying, the same people who had clutched their belongings tighter when Tammy first walked through from economy class. But something had shifted. The invisible barriers that separated first class from economy, wealth from poverty, belonging from otherness, they hadn't disappeared, but they'd been acknowledged, questioned, cracked open just enough to let something human through. "Would you like to sit down?" Terry asked, gesturing to the empty seat beside him. Clara's seat, the one he'd left vacant for 6 months like a shrine to absence. "You shouldn't have to stand while holding her." Tammy hesitated, glancing back toward the economy carriage where her things were, where she belonged according to the rules of trains, in class, in society. Terry saw the calculation in her eyes, the fear of overstepping, of being told she didn't belong. "Please," Terry added softly, "it's the least I can do." Slowly, carefully, Tammy sank into the seat beside him, still cradling Lila against her chest. The leather was butter soft beneath her, the legroom expansive compared to the cramped economy seats. She looked both out of place and perfectly natural, a contradiction that made Terry's carefully ordered worldview tilt on its axis. "Thank you, Mr. Tammy prompted. "Kirk, Terry Kirk." He extended his hand and Tammy shook it with a firm grip that surprised him. "And thank you, Tammy, for Lila, for—" He struggled to find words for what she'd given him. Not just a quiet baby, but a reminder of what compassion looked like when it wasn't transactional. "For caring." Tammy smiled, and for a moment they simply sat together in companionable silence. Two strangers bound by grief and chance, and a crying baby on a train. The rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails filled the space between them, steady and forward-moving, carrying them both toward destinations they couldn't yet see. Outside, the landscape continued to blur past. Inside, something had begun to shift, not loudly or dramatically, but with the quiet inevitability of two lives beginning to intertwine. 40 minutes into the journey, Lila had finally surrendered to sleep in Tammy's arms, her small chest rising and falling with the peaceful rhythm of someone who'd exhausted herself completely. Terry watched his daughter's face, relaxed now, the tension smoothed away, and felt a mixture of relief and something deeper, something uncomfortably close to shame. "Would you join me in the cafe car?" Terry asked, keeping his voice low so as not to wake Lila. "Let me at least buy you something to eat. It's the least I can do after what you've done for us." Tammy hesitated, glancing down at the sleeping baby in her arms. "I don't want to impose—" "You're not," Terry interrupted gently. "Please, I insist." After a moment's consideration, Tammy nodded. Together, they made their way down the aisle, Terry carrying Lila with the careful reverence of someone handling something infinitely precious and infinitely fragile. Oh, passengers watched them pass, the billionaire in the maroon suit and the poor teenage girl who'd performed a miracle, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and quiet admiration. The cafe car was nearly empty at this hour, just a few scattered passengers nursing coffees and staring out at the passing countryside. Terry guided Tammy to a table by the window, settling Lila into the crook of his arm before gesturing to the menu board above the counter. "Order whatever you'd like," he said. "Seriously, anything." Tammy studied the menu with the careful attention of someone unaccustomed to choosing freely. Terry noticed how her eyes skipped over the more expensive items, the hot meals, the premium sandwiches, landing instead on the cheapest option, a basic cheese toastie and tap water. "I'll have the panini with chicken and pesto," Terry said to the attendant, And she'll have, he looked at Tammy expectantly. The cheese toasty is fine, Tammy said quickly. 2 chicken pesto paninis, Terry corrected, his tone brooking no argument. And 2 hot chocolates, with the fancy marshmallows. The attendant smiled knowingly and moved to prepare their order. Tammy opened her mouth to protest, but Terry raised a hand. Tammy, you just saved me from what might have been the worst 5 hours of my life. The absolute minimum I can do is buy you a decent meal. Please don't argue. A small smile tugged at Tammy's lips. Thank you, Mr. Kirk. Terry, he corrected. Just Terry. They settled into their seats as the train rocked gently beneath them, the rhythm almost soothing now that Lila was finally at peace. Outside the window, the landscape had shifted from London's suburban sprawl to rolling green hills dotted with sheep and ancient stone walls. So, Terry said, leaning back slightly, tell me more about this poetry competition. It must be important if you're traveling all this way alone. Tammy's eyes lit up with a passion that transformed her entire face. It's the National Youth Poetry Championship, the biggest competition in the UK for under-18s. Winners get a full scholarship to any university that accepts them. Tuition, accommodation, everything. That's incredible, Terry said, genuinely impressed. How did you qualify? I won the London Regional Slam back in June, Tammy explained, her voice carrying a quiet pride. Beat out 300 other poets. My community center ran a crowdfunding campaign to get me the train fare to Edinburgh. 57 people donated. Her voice caught slightly on that last sentence, and Terry saw tears glimmer in her eyes before she blinked them away. Most of them can barely afford their own rent, but they gave me money anyway. Terry felt something tighten in his chest. Well, that's extraordinary, Tammy. They must believe in you very much. They do, she whispered, which is why I can't let them down. The attendant returned with their order, setting down 2 steaming paninis and 2 oversized hot chocolates topped with whipped cream and marshmallows. Tammy stared at her meal like it was something sacred. Eat, Terry encouraged gently. Please. Tammy picked up the panini and took a small, careful bite. Then another, larger one. Terry could see her restraint breaking down, hunger winning out over propriety. He turned his attention to his own meal, giving her the privacy to eat without being watched. For several minutes, they ate in companionable silence, the only sounds the gentle hum of conversation from other passengers and the rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails. Lila continued to sleep peacefully in Terry's arms, one tiny fist curled against his chest. What about your family? Terry asked eventually, his tone casual but his curiosity genuine. Your parents must be proud of what you've accomplished. Tammy's expression shifted, the light in her eyes dimming slightly. It's just my mom and me now, and my 2 younger sisters, Maya and Keisha. They're 12 and 9. And your father? Terry asked, then immediately regretted the question when he saw Tammy's jaw tighten. Left when I was 11, haven't seen him since. She said it matter-of-factly, but Terry heard the old wound beneath the words. Mom works 2 jobs, cleaner at a hospital during the day, night shifts at a homeless shelter 3 times a week. She couldn't take time off to come with me, but she made me promise to call her the second the competition ends. She sounds like a remarkable woman, Terry said quietly. She is. Tammy's voice was fierce with loyalty. She taught me everything that matters. How to be strong, how to care for people, how to see beauty even when the world is ugly. Terry thought of his own mother, a society woman who'd cared more about appearances than substance, who'd taught him that money could solve any problem and that emotions were inconvenient weaknesses to be managed. The contrast with Tammy's upbringing was stark, almost painful. You mentioned your brother earlier, Terry said carefully, treading into territory he knew was sensitive. Jamie, how old was he when... Tammy set down her panini, her appetite suddenly gone. 4. He'd just turned 4. Her voice was barely above a whisper. He got sick in February, started with a cough, then a fever. Mom took him to A&E, but the wait was 7 hours. By the time they saw him, his breathing was bad. They sent us home with antibiotics and told us to come back if it got worse. Terry found himself leaning forward, drawn into her story despite the pain it clearly caused her to tell it. It got worse that night, Tammy continued, her eyes fixed on the table. We called an ambulance, but there was a delay. Winter crisis, they said. Not enough units. When they finally came, Jamie was... She paused, swallowing hard. The doctors said if he'd gotten to hospital 6 hours earlier, the antibiotics would have worked. 6 hours. Tammy, I'm so sorry. The words felt inadequate, meaningless in the face of such preventable tragedy. She looked up at him then, and Terry was struck by the raw honesty in her gaze. The thing is, Mr. Kirk, Terry, it shouldn't have happened. Jamie died because we couldn't afford private care. Because we were on a council estate where ambulances take longer to come. Because poverty kills people in ways that are invisible to everyone who doesn't live it. Terry felt something crack open inside him, a wall he'd built between his own grief and the broader inequities of the world. My wife died 6 months ago, he heard himself saying, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. Clara, pancreatic cancer, stage 4 by the time they found it. Tammy's expression softened immediately. I'm so sorry. I spent millions trying to save her, Terry continued, his voice thick with emotion he had been suppressing for months. Flew to Switzerland for experimental treatments, hired the best oncologists in Europe, funded research into new therapies, and none of it mattered. She died anyway, in a private hospital room that cost more per night than most people earn in a month. But at least you tried, Tammy said gently. At least you had the chance to fight for her. The simple truth of that statement hit Terry like a physical blow. Yes, he'd tried. He'd had every resource at his disposal, every advantage that wealth could buy. And still Clara had died. Still he had been powerless in the end. But at least he'd tried. At least he hadn't watched her slip away, knowing that money, the thing he had in abundance, stood between her and survival. You're right, Terry said quietly. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have compared. No, Tammy interrupted, shaking her head. Grief isn't a competition. Your pain isn't less real just because you had money. Loss is loss. For a long moment, they sat in silence. Two strangers bound by wounds that looked different on the surface but cut just as deep. Terry looked down at Lila sleeping in his arms and thought about all the ways he could fail her, all the ways the world could take her from him despite his wealth and influence. And then he thought about Jamie, about Tammy holding her brother as he struggled to breathe, powerless to save him, not because the medicine didn't exist, but because it was out of reach. How do you do it? Terry asked finally. How do you keep going after something like that? How do you not just break? Tammy was quiet for a moment, her fingers wrapped around her hot chocolate mug. You do break, she said eventually, but then you put yourself back together because people are counting on you, because giving up would dishonor the people you lost, because, she paused, searching for words, because surviving is its own kind of victory, I guess. Terry felt tears prick his eyes, the first he had allowed himself to shed in public since Clara's funeral. I haven't been doing that, he admitted. Surviving, I've been existing, going through the motions, throwing myself into work so I don't have to feel anything. That's surviving too, Tammy said softly. Maybe not the healthiest way, but it's still survival. And you're here now, aren't you, with your daughter, trying. Because I had no choice, Terry laughed bitterly. The nanny canceled last minute, and I couldn't reschedule my meetings. But you came anyway, Tammy pointed out. You could have sent someone else to the meetings, delayed the whole trip, but you brought Lila because, on some level, you wanted to. You wanted to be with her. Terry looked down at his daughter's sleeping face and realized Tammy was right. Somewhere beneath his grief and his fear of failing as a single father, he'd wanted this. Wanted to be present for Lila in ways he'd never quite managed when Clara was alive, when work had always seemed more urgent than family. Thank you, he said, his voice hoarse, for everything. For Lila, yes, but also for this. He gestured vaguely at the space between them. For being honest, for seeing me. For the first time in months, I feel like someone actually sees me, not just the money or the title or the tragedy. Tammy smiled, and it was like sunlight breaking through clouds. I see you, Terry Kirk, and I think your wife would be proud of you for trying. Outside the window, the landscape continued to roll past, hills giving way to forests, forests giving way to villages, the journey carrying them forward, whether they were ready or not. Inside the cafe car, two people from opposite worlds sat across from each other, their grief and hope and humanity intertwined in ways neither of them fully understood yet, but they both felt it, that rare, precious recognition of being truly seen by another person. Not as billionaire or poor girl, not as success or struggle, but as two human beings carrying the weight of loss and trying, in their own imperfect ways, to keep moving forward. The train continued north, and with every mile something shifted between them, a connection being forged that would change both their lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Marcus Chen had been traveling in the seat directly behind Terry Kirk when the baby started crying. As a freelance journalist constantly hunting for stories that mattered, he'd watch the entire scene unfold with the instincts of someone who recognized a narrative when he saw one. The crying baby, the desperate billionaire. He'd recognize Terry Kirk from business magazines and financial news segments. The hostile passengers growing increasingly irritated. And then the poor black teenage girl walking up from economy class, risking judgment and ridicule to offer help. Marcus had pulled out his phone almost without thinking. His finger hovered over the record button as the girl took the baby in her arms. He told himself he was capturing something beautiful, something that needed to be shared. But deep down, he knew what he was really thinking. This is gold. The video was 47 seconds long. It opened with the baby's piercing screams echoing through the carriage, then panned to show the teenage girl, worn clothes, patched backpack, braids falling over her shoulders, gently taking the infant from the exhausted man in the expensive suit. The audio captured her soft humming, the gradual quieting of the cries, and finally the moment of absolute silence that fell over the carriage when the baby stopped crying completely. Marcus added a caption, "The girl who silenced a train." He posted it to Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok simultaneously at 3:47 p.m., barely 20 minutes after the moment had happened. Then he put his phone away and returned to his newspaper, thinking nothing more of it. By 4:15 p.m., the video had 10,000 views. By 4:45 p.m., it had 100,000. By the time the train began its approach into Edinburgh Waverley Station at 5:30 p.m., the video had been viewed over 2 million times. Tammy first noticed something was wrong when her phone started buzzing incessantly in her backpack. She'd returned to sit with Terry in first class after their conversation in the cafe car, Lila now sleeping peacefully in a portable bassinet the attendants had provided. Terry was reviewing some documents on his tablet while Tammy rehearsed her competition piece silently, her lips moving as she committed the words to memory. The buzzing continued. Then it became a constant vibration, like someone was calling her repeatedly. "Is that your phone?" Terry asked, glancing up from his work. Tammy pulled it out, frowning at the screen. Her lock screen was flooded with notifications. Instagram DMs, Twitter mentions, Facebook messages, texts from numbers she didn't recognize. Dozens of them, hundreds. "What the?" She unlocked her phone and her eyes widened. "Oh my God. What is it?" Terry leaned over, concerned by the sudden alarm in her voice. Tammy held up her phone, her hand trembling slightly. On the screen was a video, her in the video holding Lila, humming the lullaby that had calmed the baby. The view count kept climbing as she watched. 2.1 million, 2.2 million, 2.3 million. Terry's expression shifted from confusion to recognition to something darker, a flash of anger mixed with resignation. "Someone filmed us." "There are reporters in my DMs," Tammy said, scrolling through the flood of messages with growing panic. BBC, Sky News, The Guardian. "They're all asking for interviews. They want my full name, where I'm from, why I was on the train." Her voice rose with each word. Terry pulled out his own phone and typed quickly. Within seconds, his face confirmed what Tammy already knew. "It's everywhere. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. The girl who silenced a train. They're calling you a hero." "I'm not a hero," Tammy whispered, staring at her phone in disbelief. "I just helped a baby. People do that every day." "Not across class lines on a train," Terry said quietly. "Not in a way people can package into a narrative about faith and humanity." The train's PA system crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be arriving at Edinburgh Waverley in approximately 10 minutes. Please ensure you have all your belongings with you." Tammy felt her stomach drop. 10 minutes. The competition registration was at 7 p.m. She'd planned to go straight to the venue, check in, and prepare herself mentally for tomorrow's performance. But now, they'll be waiting at the station, Terry said, his voice grim with certainty. Journalists, photographers. This is how these things work. A viral moment becomes a media circus. But I don't want, Tammy started, then stopped. What didn't she want? Attention? Recognition? She'd spent years performing poetry about being invisible, about being overlooked because of her postcode and the color of her skin. And now, suddenly, the entire country was looking at her, but for all the wrong reasons. What do you want to do? Terry asked. And Tammy appreciated that he was asking rather than telling her. I want to compete, she said firmly. I want to focus on my poetry, not become some feel-good story for people to share and forget about in a week. Terry nodded, something shifting in his expression, a decision being made. Then we'll make that happen. The train began to slow as Edinburgh's cityscape appeared outside the windows, gray stone buildings and church spires silhouetted against the late afternoon sky. Tammy watched other passengers gathering their belongings, oblivious to the storm waiting on the platform. But Marcus Chen, in the row behind them, was already packing up his things with the satisfied smile of someone who just struck gold. As the train pulled into Waverley Station, Tammy looked out the window and felt her heart sink. Even from the train, she could see them, a cluster of people with cameras and recording equipment, smartphones held aloft, all facing the platform where first-class passengers would disembark. Oh God, she breathed. Terry saw them too. His jaw tightened and something hardened in his eyes, the same look he probably wore in boardrooms when making difficult decisions. He stood, scooping Lila up from the bassinet with practiced care, then turned to Tammy. Stay close to me, he said. Don't answer any questions. Just keep walking. But trust me, Tammy, I've dealt with media attention my entire adult life. They want a story, and if you give them one, they'll never let you go. Right now, you need to get to that competition venue. Everything else can wait. The train doors hissed open. Terry positioned himself between Tammy and the cameras, Lila cradled against his chest. Together, they stepped onto the platform. The effect was immediate. That's them, someone shouted. Tammy, can you tell us your last name? Mr. Kirk, is it true the video has been viewed over 3 million times? How does it feel to be an internet sensation? Cameras flashed. Microphones were thrust forward. A crowd of journalists and curious bystanders pressed closer, creating a wall of noise and bodies that made Tammy's breath catch in her throat. Terry's hand found her elbow, steady and grounding. Eyes forward. Keep walking. But someone stepped directly into their path, a young woman with a BBC press badge and a cameraman behind her. Just one comment, please. The public wants to know who you are. The public wants to know who she is, Terry said coldly, his voice cutting through the chaos with the authority of someone used to being obeyed. So they can turn a private moment of kindness into tomorrow's disposable content. She's a 16-year-old girl who helped calm a crying baby. That's all you need to know. He shifted his position, deliberately placing himself between Tammy and the camera lens. His expensive suit, his commanding presence, the baby in his arms, all of it created a shield that the journalists hesitated to push through. Mr. Kirk, are you protecting her? Another reporter called out. I'm protecting a minor from exploitation, Terry replied sharply, which is what any decent person would do. Now, if you'll excuse us. He guided Tammy through the crowd with firm but gentle pressure on her elbow, his body blocking the worst of the camera angles. Lila, sensing the tension, began to whimper, and Terry murmured soothing sounds while navigating through the press of bodies. Behind them, Tammy heard the frustrated shouts of journalists demanding answers, the click and flash of cameras capturing their retreat. Her heart hammered in her chest, anxiety and anger warring for dominance. This wasn't how today was supposed to go. This wasn't the story she wanted to tell. They finally broke through to the main concourse of the station, where the crowd thinned and Terry steered them toward the taxi rank. I'm sorry, Tammy said, her voice small. This is my fault. No, Terry said firmly, flagging down a black cab. This is the fault of a culture that commodifies kindness and turns human moments into viral entertainment. You did nothing wrong. The taxi pulled up, and Terry opened the door. ushering Tammy inside before climbing in with Lila. "Where's your competition venue?" he asked. "The King's Theater on Levin Street," Tammy replied, still shaken. Terry relayed the address to the driver, then turned back to Tammy as the cab pulled away from the station. Through the rear window, she could still see the journalists on their phones, probably already filing stories about the girl who silenced a train and the billionaire who protected her. "Thank you," Tammy said quietly. "You didn't have to do that." Terry looked down at Lila, who had calmed again now that they were away from the chaos. "Yes, I did," he said. "You gave my daughter peace when she needed it most. You gave me something I'd forgotten existed, genuine human kindness with no agenda attached. The absolute minimum I can do is make sure you get to show the world who you really are on your terms, not theirs." Tammy felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. Outside the taxi window, Edinburgh rolled past in shades of gray stone and amber streetlight. Somewhere out there, millions of people were watching a 47-second video of her, sharing it, commenting on it, creating narratives about who she was based on a moment they'd witnessed through a screen. But here, in this taxi, she was just Tammy Green, 16 years old, terrified and determined in equal measure, heading toward the most important performance of her life. The competition would begin tomorrow. The world was watching now, whether she wanted it or not. And Terry Kirk, a man she'd met just hours ago, had chosen to stand between her and the chaos. For the first time since boarding the train in London, Tammy allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. The Balmoral Hotel rose above Edinburgh's Princes Street like a Victorian castle, all stone turrets and grand archways lit golden against the deepening twilight. Terry had checked in an hour earlier, settling Lila in the suite's adjoining bedroom, while his assistant coordinated with the venue staff to ensure Tammy could register for the competition without running another media gauntlet. Now, as he stood in the hotel's wood-paneled lounge watching Tammy perch uncertainly on the edge of a leather armchair, Terry felt the weight of what he was about to do settle over him like a familiar coat. The lounge was nearly empty at this hour, just a couple in the far corner, nursing cocktails, and a businessman working quietly at a corner table. Tammy looked impossibly young, surrounded by the opulence. Mahogany paneling, crystal chandeliers, waiters in crisp uniforms moving silently across plush carpeting. She'd accepted his invitation to talk somewhere quiet only after he'd assured her 3 times that Lila was safe with the hotel's concierge, who happened to be a grandmother of 5 with 40 years of child care experience. "Can I get you something?" Terry asked, gesturing toward the bar menu on the table. "Tea? Hot chocolate? They make an excellent Scottish tablet here. It's like fudge, but better." Tammy's smile was strained. "I'm fine, thank you." She wasn't fine. Terry could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her shoulders carried tension like stones. In the span of a few hours, she'd gone from anonymous teenager to viral sensation, from quiet helper to reluctant symbol of something she'd never asked to represent. "Tammy," Terry began, settling into the chair across from her, "I want to talk to you about something important. But first, I need you to know that what happened at the station, the reporters, the cameras, all of it, you can make that stop. I have lawyers who specialize in privacy law. If you want that video taken down, if you want it to remain anonymous, we can make it happen." Tammy looked surprised. "You can do that?" "I can try. No guarantees in the age of screenshots and mirrors. But we can make it significantly harder for anyone to find you or contact you without permission." For a moment, Tammy seemed to consider it. Then she shook her head slowly. "No, I don't want to hide from it. I want to do the competition first, on my own terms. Then I'll figure out how to deal with the rest." Terry felt a surge of respect for her. At 16, with the world suddenly watching, she was choosing courage over comfort. "That's very mature of you." "I don't feel mature," Tammy admitted. "I feel terrified." "Good," Terry said with a slight smile. "Fear means you understand what's at stake. Now, about tomorrow's competition, my assistant confirmed your registration. You're scheduled to perform at 2 p.m., the preliminary round." "Thank you," Tammy said quietly, "for everything. The hotel help, the protection from the journalist, letting me decompress here before I have to go back out there." She gestured vaguely toward the window, where Edinburgh sprawled in the gathering darkness. You didn't have to do any of that. Actually, I did, Terry replied. You helped Lila when no one else could, when I couldn't. That's not something I take lightly. A waiter appeared with a silver tray bearing 2 cups of tea and a plate of Scottish tablet, despite Tammy's earlier refusal. Terry nodded his thanks, and the man disappeared as silently as he'd arrived. Terry picked up his cup, using the moment to gather his thoughts. He'd been planning this conversation since the taxi ride from the station, turning the words over in his mind like puzzle pieces, trying to find the right arrangement. Now, Karen, sitting across from this remarkable young woman who'd somehow managed to crack open his grief-hardened heart in the span of a train journey, he realized there was no perfect way to say what needed to be said. Tammy, I want to talk to you about your future, Terry began carefully. Something in Tammy's expression shifted, not quite closing off, but becoming guarded. My future? I run a philanthropic foundation, Terry explained, the Kirk Foundation for Educational Excellence. We identify talented young people from disadvantaged backgrounds and provide them with the resources they need to succeed: full scholarships to university, accommodation, living expenses, internship opportunities, mentorship programs. Tammy's fingers tightened around her teacup. I've been deeply impressed by you today, Terry continued. Your compassion, your maturity, your talent. Everything you've told me about your poetry, your family, your dreams, it's clear you have extraordinary potential, and I would like to offer you a place in our scholarship program. The words hung in the air between them. Outside, Edinburgh's traffic hummed distantly. The couple in the corner laughed softly at some private joke, and Tammy sat very still, staring into her tea like it held answers she desperately needed. Full tuition to any UK university that accepts you, Terry pressed on. Student accommodation covered. Monthly stipend for living expenses. Books. Travel. Summer internships at leading companies in your field of interest. Mentorship from established poets, writers, academics. Whatever you need. Why? Tammy's voice was barely above a whisper. Because you deserve it. Because talent shouldn't be wasted due to circumstances of birth. Because you feel guilty, Tammy interrupted, finally looking up at him. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice was steady. Because I told you about Jamie dying because we couldn't afford treatment, and now you want to fix my life to make yourself feel better about having money you couldn't use to save your wife. The words hit Terry like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to deny it, to explain, to defend himself, but stopped. Because she wasn't wrong. Yes, he admitted quietly. Partly, yes. Is that such a terrible reason to help someone? Tammy set down her teacup with trembling hands. Mr. Kirk, Terry, I appreciate what you're trying to do, I really do. And I'm grateful for your help today. Truly. But I don't need to be your redemption project. That's not what this is, isn't it? Tammy's voice grew stronger, more certain. You meet a poor black girl on a train who reminds you that kindness still exists in the world. She helps your baby, shares her sad story about her dead brother, and suddenly you want to rescue her. Make her your charity case. Feel like you've done something meaningful with all that money that couldn't save the person you actually wanted to save. Each word landed with surgical precision, cutting through Terry's carefully constructed rationalization to expose the raw truth beneath. He felt shame flood through him, hot, uncomfortable, undeniable. You're right, Terry said, his voice rough. You're absolutely right, and I'm sorry. Tammy blinked, clearly not expecting the admission. I've been trying to buy redemption, Terry continued, for months, since Clara died. I've thrown money at grief counselors, therapists, support groups, anyone who promised to help me feel less broken. I've donated to cancer research, funded hospital wings, sponsored other people's children through university. All of it trying to what? Prove that I'm not useless? That my wealth means something beyond just numbers and accounts? He ran a hand through his hair, suddenly exhausted. And then I met you. And you helped Lila not because you wanted something from me, not because you thought I could do something for you, but because a baby was crying and you knew how to help. Pure, uncomplicated kindness. And yes, it made me want to fix things for you. to use my resources to ensure your talent doesn't go to waste the way Jamie's life was wasted. Jamie's life wasn't wasted, Tammy said sharply. He was loved. He mattered. His death was a tragedy, but his life had value. You're right. I'm sorry. Poor choice of words. Terry took a breath, trying to organize his thoughts. Tammy, I'm not good at this, at connecting with people, at doing things that aren't transactional. My whole life has been about deals and negotiations and finding win-win scenarios. And I know that's not an excuse, but it's all I know how to be. Tammy watched him with those pointing, ancient eyes that shouldn't belong to someone so young. I don't want to be saved, Terry. I want to be respected. I do respect you. Then respect that I can work my own way, Tammy said firmly. I've been doing it my whole life. My mom taught me that dignity means not taking what you haven't earned. That charity can be kind, but it can also be another kind of cage. Terry felt something crack inside him. Not breaking, but opening. Like a door he'd kept locked, suddenly swinging wide to reveal a truth he'd been avoiding. What if it's not charity? He asked slowly. What if it's investment? Tammy frowned. What do you mean? The Kirk Foundation scholarship isn't charity, Terry explained, the idea taking shape as he spoke. It's an investment in talent. We don't just give money away, we identify people who will change the world and help them get there faster. In return, we ask scholarship recipients to mentor future students, to contribute to the foundation's mission, to pay it forward when they're in a position to do so. That's still charity dressed up in business language, Tammy said, but her tone was less certain now. Maybe, Terry conceded, or maybe it's recognition that talent exists everywhere but opportunity doesn't. Maybe it's acknowledgement that the system is broken and people like you shouldn't have to work 3 times as hard for half the chance. Maybe it's about leveling a playing field that's been tilted since before either of us were born. He leaned forward, his voice earnest. Tammy, I'm not trying to rescue you. You don't need rescuing. But if there's a way I can help remove some of the barriers between you and your dreams, barriers that shouldn't exist in the first place, why is that wrong? Tammy was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. Outside, a church bell chimed the hour, 8 deep tones that resonated through the lounge. I need to think about it, she said finally. After the competition. After I know whether I've actually earned something on my own merit, not because I went viral or because a billionaire felt sorry for me. Terry nodded slowly. It wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't refusal either. That's fair. And Tammy, for what it's worth, you've already earned my respect. Everything else is just logistics. A small smile tugged at Tammy's lips, the first genuine one since they'd entered the lounge. Logistics. That's a very billionaire way of putting it. It's the only language I speak fluently, Terry admitted with a rueful smile. I'm still learning the others. Tammy picked up a piece of Scottish tablet from the plate, examining it curiously before taking a small bite. Her eyes widened. Oh, that's good. Told you, Terry said, relieved to see some of the tension leave her shoulders. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the weight of the conversation settling around them like dust after a storm. Terry realized that this, being told no, being challenged, being forced to examine his own motivations, was exactly what he'd needed. Tammy hadn't accepted his offer with grateful tears or overwhelming gratitude. She'd questioned it, pushed back, demanded he see her as an equal rather than a project. And somehow that made him want to help her even more. Not to fix his own grief or buy redemption, but because the world needed more people like Tammy Green. People who understood the difference between kindness and pity, between opportunity and obligation. You should get some rest, Terry said eventually. Tomorrow's a big day. My assistant reserved a room for you here in the hotel, separate from mine, of course. Safe, quiet, away from reporters. Tammy hesitated. I can't afford... It's covered, Terry interrupted gently. Not charity, not investment, just logistics. You need a place to sleep, and I have more hotel points than I'll ever use. Let me do this one small thing. After a moment, Tammy nodded. Okay, thank you. As they stood to leave the lounge, Tammy paused. Terry, What you said earlier about learning other languages besides business, I think you're doing better than you give yourself credit for. Terry felt an unexpected warmth in his chest. Thanks to you. Thanks to a crying baby on a train, Tammy corrected with a smile. Thanks to someone who heard that crying and chose to help, Terry said quietly. They walked together through the hotel's grand lobby, two people from different worlds learning to speak each other's language, one difficult conversation at a time. Chapter 7. The poem that moved a city. Tammy stood in the wings of the King's Theater, her hands trembling as she clutched her notebook against her chest. Through the gap in the heavy velvet curtains, she could see the auditorium filling with people. Judges in the front row with their clipboards and serious expressions, families scattered throughout the middle sections, and at the back, partially obscured by shadows, other competitors waiting their turn. The competition had been running since 10 that morning. Tammy had sat through 17 performances already, each one brilliant in its own way. A girl from Manchester had performed a haunting piece about her grandmother's dementia. A boy from Cardiff had delivered a rapid-fire spoken word about climate anxiety that left the audience breathless. A non-binary poet from Glasgow had woven Scots dialect with English in a piece about identity that made Tammy question whether her own work was good enough. Competitor 18, the stage manager called softly. You're on in 2 minutes. Tammy nodded, not trusting her voice. Her throat felt tight, her palms slick with sweat. The poem she'd written, Trains Don't Separate Hearts, suddenly seemed too personal, too raw, too specific to the strange 24 hours she'd just lived through. What if people thought she'd written it just to capitalize on the viral video? What if they accused her of using Terry's daughter for inspiration? No, she told herself firmly. You wrote this before you knew the video existed, before any of this became public. You wrote it because it was true. She closed her eyes and thought about the train journey, about holding Lila and feeling Jamie's absence like a physical wound, about Terry's grief mirroring her own across the vast divide of wealth and circumstance, about the moment when two strangers recognized each other's humanity and chose connection over isolation. That was the story worth telling. Not the viral video, not the fairy tale narrative of rich man and poor girl, but the simple, complicated truth of what happens when people actually see each other. Competitor 18, you're up, the stage manager whispered, gesturing toward the stage. Tammy took a deep breath and walked through the curtain. The stage lights were blinding at first, washing out the audience into an indistinct blur of faces and shadows. The microphone stood center stage, a slim silver line catching the light. Tammy's worn trainers squeaked slightly on the polished floor as she approached it, and she heard a few sympathetic chuckles from the audience. Good afternoon, she said, her voice steadier than she'd expected. My name is Tammy Green, I'm 16, and I'm from Southwark in South London. I'll be performing an original piece titled Trains Don't Separate Hearts. As her eyes adjusted to the lights, Tammy scanned the back rows. And there, partially hidden in the shadows of the upper gallery, she saw him, Terry Kirk, holding a sleeping Lila against his shoulder, his expression unreadable from this distance, but his presence unmistakable. He'd come, despite everything he had to do, despite his business meetings and his grief and his complicated life, he'd come to watch her perform. Tammy felt something warm and steady settle in her chest. She wasn't alone up here. She'd never been alone. She stepped closer to the microphone and began. I met a stranger on a train between two cities, between grief and hope, between first class and economy, between the life I've lived and the life I'm reaching for. His daughter was crying. That specific pitch that pierces straight through pretense, that strips away the difference between rich and poor. That reminds us we all entered this world the same way, small, helpless, crying for comfort we couldn't name. And I shouldn't have walked up that aisle somehow. I knew what crossing that invisible line would cost. The stares, the judgment, the assumption that my worn clothes meant I had nothing to offer. That poverty somehow diminishes wisdom. That the poorest hands can't hold the richest hearts. But I heard my brother and that baby's cry. Jamie, who left us 6 months ago because pneumonia doesn't wait for paychecks, because ambulances move slower in poor neighborhoods, because some deaths are preventable, but only if you can afford prevention. I took the baby, Lila, her name is Lila, and hummed the lullaby my mother sang at the shelter, The one passed down through generations of women who learned to soothe pain they couldn't cure, to offer comfort when they had nothing else to give. And something impossible happened. Silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of peace, the silence that comes when someone finally feels safe. The stranger looked at me, really looked. Not at my fraying clothes or my patched backpack, but at my hands holding his daughter, at the miracle of compassion that costs nothing but risks everything. We talked, him and me, two people who'd both lost someone 6 months ago. His wife to cancer despite millions spent trying to save her. My brother to poverty despite everything being available to save him. Different griefs wearing the same exhausted face. He told me money can't buy everything. I told him it can buy some things. We were both right. We were both wrong. We were both learning that grief is the great equalizer. That loss doesn't check your bank balance before it breaks you. Trains don't separate hearts. People do. We build these invisible carriages, first class and economy, us and them, deserving and undeserving, and we forget that we're all passengers heading toward the same destination, carrying the same human need to be seen, to be held, to be reminded that we matter. Sometimes the poorest hands hold the richest hearts. Sometimes silence is a song only compassion can write. Sometimes a crying baby on a train is the universe asking if we still remember how to cross the aisle, how to risk judgment, how to offer our hands even when we're not sure they'll be taken. I'm grateful for that train, for the baby who cried, for the stranger who let me help, for the reminder that human connection doesn't require anything except the willingness to try. Because in the end, we're all just trying to get somewhere better than where we started. And maybe the point isn't whether we travel first class or economy, but whether we're willing to look across the aisle and recognize ourselves in someone else's struggle, in someone else's grief, in someone else's desperate, beautiful hope that tomorrow might be gentler than today. Trains don't separate hearts. Only fear does that, only pride, only the lie that we're fundamentally different instead of fundamentally the same. So I'm choosing connection. I'm choosing to walk that aisle again and again, to risk judgment, to offer my hands, to hum lullabies learned in shelters for babies born in penthouses. Because that's what it means to be human, to see someone crying and refuse to let them cry alone. The final word hung in the air like a prayer. Tammy stepped back from the microphone, her heart hammering so hard she was sure the entire auditorium could hear it. For a moment, one long, terrible moment, there was only silence. Then someone into the front row began to clap. One of the judges, an older woman with silver hair and tears streaming down her face. The applause spread like wildfire. The other judges joined in, then the audience, rising to their feet row by row until the entire theater was standing, clapping, some crying openly, others shouting, "Brava!" with voices thick with emotion. Tammy stood frozen on stage, overwhelmed by the wave of response washing over her. In the back gallery, she saw Terry standing too, carefully balancing Lila while clapping with one hand against his chest. Even from this distance, she could see the tears on his face. The applause continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute. When it finally began to subside, Tammy managed a small bow and walked off stage on legs that felt like water. In the wings, the stage manager grabbed her arm, beaming. "That was extraordinary. I've worked this competition for 8 years, and I've never seen a response like that." Tammy couldn't respond. She was shaking, adrenaline and relief and terror flooding through her in equal measure. She'd done it. She'd performed the poem that mattered, the one that told the truth, the one that might finally open doors she'd been pushing against her entire life. 3 hours later, after the final competitor had performed and the judges had deliberated, Tammy stood backstage with the other finalists, 10 poets from across the UK, all brilliant, all deserving. The head judge, Professor Eleanor Davies from the University of Edinburgh, stepped to the microphone with an envelope in her hands. This year's National Youth Poetry Championship was the most competitive we've ever witnessed, she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed theater. Every single finalist demonstrated extraordinary talent, courage, and artistry. But one performance stood out not just for its technical excellence, but for its profound humanity and its urgent relevance to the world we live in today. Tammy's heart stopped. The winner of this year's National Youth Poetry Championship and recipient of a full university scholarship is, the pause felt eternal, Tammy Green. Shayete. Trains don't separate hearts. The theater erupted. Tammy stood frozen for a heartbeat, unable to process what she just heard. Then the other finalists were pushing her forward, congratulating her with genuine warmth, and she was walking back onto the stage toward Professor Davies, who held out both the trophy and the scholarship certificate with a smile that radiated pride. "You did something remarkable today," Professor Davies said quietly as she handed Tammy the awards. "You reminded all of us why poetry matters. Thank you." Tammy accepted the trophy, a beautiful glass sculpture of an open book, and turned to face the audience. The applause washed over her again, and this time she let herself feel it fully. The validation, the recognition, the proof that her voice, her story, her truth mattered. In the back gallery, Kirk stood clapping harder than anyone, Lila still sleeping peacefully against his shoulder, his face wet with tears he wasn't bothering to hide. And Tammy understood finally what this moment meant. Not just the scholarship or the trophy or the viral fame that would inevitably grow from this, but the simple, powerful truth that she'd told her story on her own terms, that she'd earned this victory through her own talent and courage, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the world actually listened when you found the right words. She'd won. Not just the competition, but something larger and more important. She'd won the right to keep telling her truth, louder and clearer than ever before. The cafe was tucked down a narrow, cobbled lane off the Royal Mile, the kind of place locals knew about but tourists rarely found. Terry had discovered it years ago during a business trip, small, warm, with mismatched furniture and windows that looked out onto Edinburgh's medieval rooftops. It felt like the perfect place for a conversation that mattered. He'd suggested meeting here after the awards ceremony, after the photographers and journalists had finally dispersed, after Tammy had called her mother crying tears of joy and disbelief, after the chaos had settled into something quieter and more real. Now Terry sat at a corner table, Lila sleeping peacefully in her pram beside him, watching Tammy cradle a cup of hot chocolate like it was something precious. The trophy from the competition sat on the table between them, catching the afternoon light filtering through the window. "I still can't believe it happened," Tammy said for the third time, her voice soft with wonder. "I keep expecting someone to tell me there was a mistake, that I didn't actually win." "You won," Terry said firmly, "and not because of the viral video or the story or any of the noise around it. You won because your poem was extraordinary, because you found words for something most people can't articulate, that moment when we choose to see each other's humanity instead of our differences." Tammy looked up at him, her eyes bright. "You really think so?" "Tammy, I've never felt more proud of anyone outside my family," Terry said, and realized as the words left his mouth that they were completely true. Watching her perform today, seeing her courage and vulnerability on that stage, witnessing the way her words moved an entire auditorium to tears, it had stirred something in him he thought had died with Clara. Tammy's expression softened into something that looked like affection. "Maybe that's what family means," she said gently. "People who remind you what you forgot." Terry felt the words land in his chest like an arrow finding its mark. Family. Not defined by blood or legal documents, but by recognition, by the choice to show up for each other, by the willingness to be changed by someone else's story. "You've reminded me of a lot of things," Terry admitted. "How to feel, how to connect, how to see beyond the categories I've used to organize the world. Rich, poor, deserving, undeserving. You've shown me that those labels are just barriers we build to protect ourselves from having to actually care about each other." "I didn't do anything special," Tammy protested. "I just helped a baby." "You did something radical," Terry corrected. "You crossed a line most people won't cross. And in doing so, you changed my life." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the cafe's gentle hum of conversation and clinking dishes creating a cocoon around them. Terry watched Lila sleep and thought about all the ways his daughter's life would be different because of this chance encounter on a train. "I've been thinking," Terry said finally, setting down his coffee cup. About what you said yesterday, about not wanting to win my charity project, about earning your own way. Tammy's expression became guarded. Terry, hear me out, wow, he interrupted gently. I've spent the last 24 hours reflecting on my motivations. And you were right. I was trying to fix my grief by fixing your circumstances. That wasn't fair to either of us. I appreciate you acknowledging that, Tammy said carefully. But, Terry continued, I think there might be another way. A partnership, not a handout. Tammy tilted her head, curiosity replacing caution. What kind of partnership? Terry leaned forward, his voice gaining energy as the idea took shape. I want to fund a youth arts initiative in your community. In Southwark. Something substantial. Not a one-off donation, but a long-term commitment. A center that provides mentorship, resources, performance spaces, scholarships for young artists who wouldn't otherwise have access to those opportunities. That sounds like charity, Tammy pointed out, though her eyes had lit with interest. It would be if I designed it, Terry agreed, but I don't want to design it. I want you to. Tammy's eyes widened. Me? You know what your community needs. You know the barriers young artists face. You understand the difference between help that empowers and help that patronizes. Terry's words came faster now, fueled by genuine excitement. I can provide the funding, the business infrastructure, the connections, but you provide the vision, the cultural competency, the voice that ensures we're actually serving the community instead of imposing solutions from outside. Terry, I'm 16, and you just won a national poetry championship. Terry interrupted. You're brilliant, articulate, and you have credibility with exactly the people we need to reach. Plus, you'll have a team, professional advisors, youth workers, experienced arts educators. You wouldn't be doing it alone. Tammy was quiet, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup as she considered. A real partnership? Not you making decisions and asking me to rubber stamp them? A real partnership, Terry confirmed. With you as creative director or youth advisor or whatever title makes sense. Paid position, obviously. And part of your scholarship support includes internship experience. This would count. What's in it for you? Tammy asked, and Terry appreciated her directness. Honestly, redemption still, but not the cheap kind. He paused, searching for the right words. I told you my wife used to say the things worth doing are the things that make people uncomfortable. For years, I've written checks to causes that let me feel good without actually challenging me to change. This would be different. Working with you, learning from you, being accountable to a community I don't understand. That makes me uncomfortable. That forces me to grow. So I'm your uncomfortable growth opportunity? Tammy asked, but she was smiling. You're my reminder that privilege without purpose is just another kind of poverty, Terry said quietly. And that wealth means nothing if we don't use it to bridge the gaps between us. Tammy took a sip of her hot chocolate, and Terry could see her mind working, weighing possibilities against risks, dreams against pragmatism. Outside the cafe window, Edinburgh's late afternoon light painted the cobblestones gold. I'd need time, Tammy said finally, to finish school, to start university. I can't drop everything to run a youth center. Of course not. This would be a long-term project. We'd spend the next year planning, consulting with the community leaders, securing a space. You'd contribute when you can, around your studies. As you grow into the role, your involvement would grow too. And my mom would have to be involved, Tammy added. She knows the community better than anyone, and she'd keep both of us honest. Terry smiled. I'd love to meet her, get her input, her approval. She's going to think this is insane, Tammy said, but she was grinning now. Probably, Terry agreed, but is it the good kind of insane or the bad kind? Tammy looked down at her trophy, at the scholarship certificate she'd earned through talent and determination, at the evidence that her voice mattered. Then she looked at Terry, really looked at him, not as a billionaire or a savior or a viral video co-star, but as a person, a complicated, grieving, well-meaning person trying to figure out how to use his resources to make the world slightly less broken. The good kind, she said softly. I think it's the good kind of insane. So you'll do it? You'll help me build this? Terry asked, hope threading through his voice. On one condition, Tammy said firmly. Name it. We call it the Jamie Green Youth Arts Center, Tammy said, her voice catching slightly. After my brother, so kids like him, kids from neighborhoods where opportunities are scarce and futures feel predetermined, they have a place that says their creativity matters, that they matter. Terry felt tears prick his eyes. That's perfect. Jamie Green Youth Arts Center. I can't think of a better name. Tammy wiped at her own eyes, laughing through tears. We're crying in a cafe. People are staring. Let them stare, Terry said, his voice warm. We're planning something beautiful. And it was beautiful, Terry realized. Not the transactional charity he'd practiced for years, not the guilt-driven redemption he'd been seeking since Clara died. This was something entirely different, a genuine collaboration between two people from different worlds, united by shared grief and newfound hope. It wasn't about billionaire saving poor girl. It was about two souls recognizing each other's wounds and choosing to heal together. When do we start? Tammy asked, her face glowing with excitement and possibility. Tomorrow, Terry said, after we both get some sleep. I'll have my team start researching property options in Southwark. You put together a wish list of what the center should offer. And then we meet in London next week. You, me, your mother, and start building something that matters. Something that would make Jamie proud, Tammy added quietly. And Clara, Terry said, surprising himself with how easily her name came now. She would have loved this, loved you. Tammy reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Then we'll build it for both of them, and for Lila, and for every kid who needs to be reminded that their voice deserves to be heard. Terry squeezed back, feeling something shift in his chest, the first real lightness he'd experienced in 6 months. Not the absence of grief, but the presence of purpose. Not forgetting Clara, but honoring her by becoming the kind of person she'd believed he could be. To new beginnings, he said, raising his coffee cup. To trains that bring strangers together, Tammy added, lifting her hot chocolate. To crying babies who change everything, Terry continued, smiling. To family we choose, Tammy finished, her voice steady and sure. They clinked cups gently, sealing a partnership that would change both their lives and the lives of countless young people who would walk through the doors of the Jamie Green Youth Arts Center in years to come. Outside the window, Edinburgh's ancient streets stretched toward futures unwritten. Inside the cafe, two people from opposite worlds sat together, no longer divided by class or circumstance, but united by the simple revolutionary choice to see each other as fully human. The train had brought them together, but what they built next would be entirely their own creation. The Edinburgh Waverley platform was bathed in early evening light, golden and soft, as Terry and Tammy boarded the 5:40 p.m. LNER service to London King's Cross. 3 days had passed since the competition, 3 days of interviews, planning meetings, and a memorable dinner with Tammy's mother via video call that had left Terry both intimidated and deeply impressed by the woman who'd raised such a remarkable daughter. Now as they settled into their first-class seats, Tammy no longer hesitating to accept the comfort she'd earned, Terry felt a strange sense of completion, as though a circle was being drawn closed. Lila sat happily in Tammy's lap, her small hands reaching for Tammy's braids as she babbled a stream of nonsense sounds that seemed to delight them both. The baby who had screamed inconsolably on the journey north now gurgled contentedly, her dark eyes bright with curiosity as she watched the platform slip away and Edinburgh's magnificent architecture began to slide past the windows. She's so different from 3 days ago, Tammy observed, gently bouncing Lila on her knee. More settled, more at peace. She's not the only one, Terry said quietly, watching them both with an expression that felt unfamiliar on his face. Contentment, maybe. Hope. The train picked up speed, the rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails creating a soundtrack that had become oddly comforting over the past few days. Through the window, the outskirts of Edinburgh gave way to rolling countryside, the same landscape they'd traveled through in the opposite direction, but somehow it looked different now. Softer, more forgiving. I talked to the university this morning, Tammy said, her voice carrying a mixture of excitement and nervousness. The scholarship covers King's College London, which means I can stay close to home, close to Mum and the girls, and close to Southwark, for when we launch the Jamie Green Center. That's perfect, Terry said, genuinely pleased. And I spoke with my property team. They've identified 3 potential locations for the center, all within walking distance of your estate. We'll tour them together next week. Get your input on which space would work best. Tammy shifted Lila slightly and her expression thoughtful. You know what's strange? A week ago, if someone had told me I'd be planning a youth arts center with a billionaire I met on a train, I would have laughed. I would have said that kind of thing doesn't happen to girls like me. And now, Terry asked, now I think maybe the problem is we tell ourselves too many stories about what's possible and what's not, about who gets to dream and who has to just survive. Tammy looked down at Lila, who had grabbed hold of her finger and was examining it with intense concentration. Maybe the universe puts people in each other's paths for a reason, not to fix each other, but to remind each other of what matters. Terry felt emotion tighten his throat. Clara used to say something similar. She'd say the richest people are often the poorest in spirit, and the poorest people are often the richest in everything that actually matters. She was right, Tammy said simply. The train passed through Berwick-upon-Tweed, the coastal town perched between Scotland and England, its ancient bridge spanning the River Tweed like a connection between two worlds. Terry watched the landscape transform, Scottish hills giving way to English countryside, borders that existed on maps but seemed meaningless from the windows of a moving train. I've been thinking about the poetry festival, Tammy said, breaking the comfortable silence. The one we discussed for the center. What if we make it annual? Not just a performance event, but a full week, workshops, mentorship sessions, open mics, competitions, a celebration of young voices. I love that, Terry said, leaning forward with interest. We could bring in established poets as mentors, offer prizes that matter. Not just money, but publication opportunities, performance slots at major venues. Make it something young artists from across the UK want to be part of. The Jamie Green Poetry Festival, Tammy said, testing the name. Her voice caught slightly on her brother's name, but she smiled through the tears that gathered in her eyes. He would have loved that. He used to make up these ridiculous rhyming stories to make Maya and Keisha laugh. Complete nonsense, but so full of joy. Then we'll make it joyful, Terry said firmly. Not just serious and academic, but playful too. Space for silly rhymes and experimental work and everything in between. A celebration of creativity in all its forms. Lila chose that moment to let out a delighted squeal, as if endorsing the plan. Both Terry and Tammy laughed, the sound filling the first-class carriage with a warmth that seemed to soften even the businessman across the aisle who looked up from his laptop and smiled. As the train sped south through North Allerton and toward York, the daylight began to fade, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Terry watched Tammy hold his daughter, watched the gentle way she adjusted Lila's position when the baby grew restless. Watched the natural ease with which she moved through the world despite all the barriers it had placed in her path. Tammy, Terry said quietly, I need to thank you. Not just for helping Lila that first day, though that started everything, but for challenging me, for refusing to let me buy my way out of actually growing as a person, for reminding me that wealth without humanity is just another kind of poverty. Tammy looked at him with those wise, ancient eyes. You don't need to thank me, Terry. You showed up. You listened. You were willing to be uncomfortable. That's all any of us can do. Show up and be willing to change. I think Clara would have liked you very much, Terry said, his voice thick with emotion he no longer felt the need to hide. You remind me of her, actually. The same refusal to accept easy answers. The same commitment to making the world better even when it costs you something. I wish I could have met her, Tammy said softly. Me too. Terry paused, then added, but I think she'd be proud of what we're building. The Jamie Green Center, the festival, this friendship. Family, Tammy corrected gently, echoing her earlier words. People who remind you what you forgot. That's what we're becoming, isn't it? Some unconventional, cross-class, train-bound family. Terry felt tears prick his eyes, but he smiled through them. Yes, I suppose we are. The train rushed through Durham as twilight deepened into dusk, the cathedral rising majestically against the darkening sky before disappearing behind them. Inside the carriage, the lights had come on, casting everything in a warm, amber glow that felt both intimate and expansive. Lila had fallen asleep in Tammy's arms, her small body relaxed and trusting in the same way she'd been that first miraculous moment when the crying stopped. Tammy gazed out the window at the passing landscape, fields and villages and rivers flowing toward the sea, and Terry saw her lips moving silently, shaping words only she could hear. "A new poem?" he asked quietly. Tammy nodded, still looking out at the darkening countryside. "Just fragments, images. I'm not sure what it wants to be yet." "Tell me," Terry encouraged. Tammy was quiet for a moment, her reflection ghostly in the window glass, superimposed over the rolling landscape outside. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "A train carried two worlds once, one of grief, one of grace. And somewhere between the tracks, somewhere between first class and economy, somewhere between crying and silence, they found each other." Terry felt the words settle over him like a benediction. "That's beautiful." "It's just a beginning," Tammy said, but she smiled. "The rest will come. It always does." The train crossed into Newcastle, the city lights twinkling like earthbound stars, then continued south through the gathering darkness. The other passengers in the carriage had settled into their own evening rhythms, reading, working, sleeping. But Terry and Tammy sat together in companionable silence, connected by something deeper than circumstance or transaction. "What happens when we get to London?" Tammy asked eventually. "When this train journey ends and we go back to our separate lives?" Terry considered the question carefully. "I don't think our lives are separate anymore. I think that ended the moment you walked up the aisle and asked to help Lila. Now we're intertwined, connected. We'll go to our respective homes, yes, but we'll see each other next week for the property tours, and the week after that for the foundation meeting, and in the months to come as we build something meaningful together." "You make it sound so simple," Tammy said, but she was smiling. "Maybe it is simple," Terry replied. "Maybe we've just convinced ourselves that crossing the invisible lines between us has to be complicated. But what if it's as simple as choosing to see each other's humanity, as simple as walking up an aisle on a train and offering help? Or as simple as accepting that help," Tammy added. "That was hard for you too, wasn't it? Admitting you needed something you couldn't buy." "Harder than I'd like to admit," Terry confessed, "but necessary, humbling in the best possible way." As the train sped through the final stretches of countryside before London, the rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails became almost hypnotic. Terry closed his eyes and listened to the sound that had carried him through the worst hours of the past 6 months and somehow impossibly delivered him to this moment, sitting across from a 16-year-old poet holding his sleeping daughter, planning a future that honored both their grief and their hope. The crying had stopped. The world felt whole again. Not because the pain had disappeared. Grief didn't work that way. Terry understood now. Clara was still gone. Jamie was still lost. Those wounds would never fully heal. But somehow, in the space between Edinburgh and London, between despair and possibility, between isolation and connection, something new had been born. A partnership, a friendship, a family of choice. The train began to slow as the outskirts of London appeared in the darkness, familiar landmarks signaling the journey's end. Terry looked at Tammy, who was still gazing out the window, Lila sleeping peacefully in her arms, and felt a profound gratitude for the strange, beautiful chaos of life that had brought them together. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." Tammy turned from the window and met his eyes. "Thank you for listening to a crying baby, for letting a stranger help, for being brave enough to let your heart break open." "Sometimes," Terry said quietly, "the bravest thing we can do is let someone else carry us for a while." "And sometimes," Tammy replied, "the most powerful thing we can do is be there to carry them." The train pulled into London King's Cross Station with a gentle hiss of brakes, the platform lights bright after the darkness of the journey. Around them, passengers gathered their belongings, preparing to disperse into the night, into their separate lives and separate stories. But Terry and Tammy sat for a moment longer, neither quite ready to let go of this liminal space where two worlds had collided and transformed each other. Finally, gently, Tammy transferred Lila into Terry's arms. The baby stirred but didn't wake, simply burrowing into her father's chest with the trust of someone who knew she was safe. Same train, different people, Tammy said softly, standing and gathering her backpack. The same patched one she'd carried north, but somehow it looked different now, dignified, a badge of honor rather than shame. Same people, Terry corrected, standing with Lila cradled against his shoulder. Just more whole, more ourselves. They walked together down the platform toward the station concourse, the rhythmic hum of the train fading behind them but never quite disappearing. It would always be there, Terry realized. That sound of wheels on rails, carrying them forward, connecting worlds that seemed separate, but were always fundamentally part of the same journey. Outside the station, London waited, tomorrow waited. The Jamie Green Youth Arts Center waited. 1,000 futures waited, unwritten and full of possibility. But for now, in this moment, there was just the quiet echo of a train journey that had changed everything. The crying had stopped. The world felt whole again. If this story moved you, share the moment. Don't let it fade. Follow Motherland Stories and tap that like button to keep these voices alive. Every day we uncover strong stories, raw truths, and quiet acts of courage that shape our world. Join a circle of listeners, dreamers, and changemakers, because every story deserves to be heard. This wasn't just an episode, it was a call to remember. Silence hides injustice. Courage exposes it. At Motherland Stories, we don't turn away. We bear witness. Subscribe and stand with stories that challenge power and celebrate truth.